The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of paper rustling. 3 siblings sat on one side, their lawyers beside them. On the other side, an empty chair, and on the judge's desk, a photograph of a golden retriever named Winston. The estate was worth $4.2 billion. The legal battle had already cost $7 million, and at the center of it all was a dog who had been dead for 6 months. This is the story of how a pet's inheritance didn't just divide a fortune, it destroyed the people who thought they deserved it. But to understand how it ended this way, we need to go back 3 years. To a different courtroom, and to a man who was about to make a decision that would haunt his family long after he was gone. His name was Victor Harland, and on the day he signed his final will, none of his children were in the room. Victor Harland made his first million in commercial real estate By 2010, his portfolio included office buildings in 12 major cities, 3 luxury hotel chains, and a private equity firm that specialized in distressed properties. He was not a household name, but among people who understood wealth, he was legendary. He had 3 children. Catherine, 52, his eldest. She lived in Greenwich, Connecticut, with her 3rd husband and managed a small art gallery that had never turned a profit. Michael, 49, lived in Manhattan and worked as a venture capitalist, though his recent investments had been underwater for 3 years. And James, 45, the youngest, who had moved to San Diego after his 2nd divorce and hadn't held steady employment in over a decade. All 3 had been waiting for their father's death. Not openly, not cruelly, but with the kind of patient awareness that comes from knowing exactly how much money exists and exactly who controls it. Victor knew this. He'd known it for years. On March 14, 2021, Victor Harland walked into the offices of Kleeman and Associates, a boutique estate planning firm in Lower Manhattan. He was 79 years old. His doctor had given him 18 months, maybe 2 years, pancreatic cancer. Stage 4, inoperable. He brought with him a leather folder containing financial statements, property deeds, and a handwritten list of instructions. He also brought Winston, his 8-year-old golden retriever, who sat quietly beside his chair throughout the meeting. The lead attorney, Richard Kleinman, had worked with Victor for over 30 years. He'd structured dozens of trusts, managed 3 previous versions of Victor's will, and had advised him through 2 divorces. But what Victor proposed that day was unlike anything Kleinman had drafted before. Victor wanted to leave his entire estate to Winston, not symbolically, not as a publicity stunt, not with his children as secondary beneficiaries. The entire estate, $4.2 billion in assets, managed by a trust, with Winston listed as the primary and sole beneficiary for the duration of the dog's natural life. Kleinman asked the obvious questions. What happens when the dog dies? Where does the money go then? What about your children? Victor's answers were specific. After Winston's death, the trust would dissolve and the remaining assets would be donated to a foundation Victor was establishing for animal welfare and cancer research. His children would each receive a one-time payment of $500,000. Not from the trust. From a separate account, Victor had set aside specifically for that purpose $500,000 each, out of $4.2 billion. Kleinman pointed out the legal challenges this would invite. He warned Victor that his children would contest the will, that they would argue undue influence, mental incapacity, fraud, that this decision would destroy his family. Victor looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something Kleinman would later repeat in a deposition. He said, "My family destroyed itself a long time ago. I'm just making sure they can't do it with my money." The will was signed on April 2nd, 2021. 2 witnesses were present, both paralegals from the firm, neither of whom had any connection to the Harland family. The document was notarized, filed, and placed in a secure vault, Victor told no one. For the next 18 months, Victor lived quietly in his townhouse on East 74th Street. He saw his children occasionally. Catherine visited twice, both times to ask for money to keep a gallery afloat. Michael came by once every few months, usually with investment opportunities that required immediate capital. James called when he needed bail money after a DUI in July of 20, and again in October when his landlord threatened eviction. Victor gave them nothing. He told them he was restructuring his assets, that he'd explain everything when the time was right. In September of 2022, Victor's health declined rapidly. He was admitted to Mount Sinai Hospital on the 18th. Catherine, Michael, and James all flew in within 24 hours. For 3 days, they rotated through his hospital room. They talked about old memories. They apologized for being distant. They asked, carefully, about his plans for the estate. Victor told them he'd taken care of everything, that they'd be provided for, that they shouldn't worry. On September 21st, at 4:30 in the morning, Victor Harlan died. Winston was not allowed in the hospital, but a nurse later reported that Victor had asked about the dog multiple times in his final hours. The funeral was held on September 26th at a private chapel in Westchester. Fewer than 30 people attended. Victor had outlived most of his friends, and he'd never been close to extended family. The service was brief. Catherine gave a eulogy that focused mostly on Victor's business accomplishments. Michael read a poem their mother had liked. James sat in the back and said nothing. After the service, Richard Kleinman approached the three siblings. He told them he needed to schedule a formal reading of the will. He suggested the following Tuesday, October 1st, at his office. Catherine asked if there was anything she needed to know in advance. Kleinman said only that the estate was complex and that Victor had been very specific about his wishes. That Tuesday, Catherine, Michael, and James arrived at Kleinman's office at 10 in the morning. They brought their spouses. Catherine's husband, David, was a former hedge fund manager. Michael's wife, Lauren, was an attorney herself, specializing in corporate law. James came alone. They were shown into a conference room with a long mahogany table. Kleinman sat at the head. His junior partner, a woman named Sandra Yee, sat beside him with a stack of folders. Kleinman began by expressing his condolences. Then he opened the first folder and started reading. The will was 73 pages long, but the relevant section came on page 4. Victor Harlan's entire estate, including all real property, financial assets, business interests, and personal effects, with the exception of specific bequests outlined in Section 7, was to be placed in an irrevocable trust. The trust was to be managed by a team of 3 trustees, all of whom were professionals with no familial connection to the Harlans. The sole beneficiary of the trust was Winston, Victor's golden retriever. Kleinman paused. Catherine laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, like something breaking, she said. "I'm sorry, what?" Kleinman repeated it. The entire estate. Winston. $4.2 billion. Michael stood up. He said this was a joke, that it couldn't be legal, that no court would uphold a will that left billions of dollars to a dog. Kleinman continued reading. Upon Winston's death, the trust would dissolve. All remaining assets would be transferred to the Harlan Foundation for Animal Welfare and Cancer Research, a newly established non-profit organization. Victor's 3 children would each receive a one-time payment of $500,000 from a separate escrow account, which had already been funded and was not part of the trust. James asked how old the dog was. Kleinman said Winston was currently 10 years old. Golden retrievers typically live 10 to 12 years. Winston was in good health. The room went quiet. Catherine's husband, David, was the first to speak. He asked to see the full document. He wanted to know when it was signed, who witnessed it, whether Victor had been evaluated for mental competency. Kleinman slid copies of the will across the table. He explained that Victor had been evaluated by 2 independent physicians within a week of signing. Both had certified him as mentally sound. The will had been reviewed by 3 separate attorneys, all of whom had confirmed its legal structure. Victor had also recorded a video statement, which Kleinman could arrange for them to view, in which he explained his reasoning. Catherine asked what the reasoning was. Kleinman said Victor felt his children had demonstrated, over many years, an inability to manage money responsibly or to maintain meaningful relationships with him outside of financial need. He believed that leaving them a large inheritance would not improve their lives and would likely cause them harm. He wanted his wealth to serve a purpose beyond individual consumption. Micah said that was bullshit, that Victor was punishing them for not being perfect, that every family has problems. This was vindictive and cruel. Kleinman didn't argue. He simply stated the facts. The will was legal. It had been properly executed, and unless the siblings could prove undue influence, fraud, or mental incapacity, it would stand. Lorian, Michael's wife, asked about the trustees. Warite? What authority did they have? Kleinman provided names. The 3 trustees were Harold Chun, a retired federal judge, Margaret Osei, a certified public accountant with 40 years of experience in estate management, and Dr. Vincent Torres, a veterinarian who specialized in geriatric animal care. Their responsibilities included managing the estate's assets, ensuring Winston's care, and making distributions according to the terms of the trust. Catherine asked how much it cost to take care of a dog. Kleinman said the trust allocated up to $50,000 per year for Winston's care, including housing, food, medical expenses, and staffing. Anything beyond that required approval from all 3 trustees. $50,000 a year, out of an estate that generated approximately $200 million annually in passive income. James asked what happened to the rest of the money. Kleinman explained that the trust was required to preserve the principal. Investment income could be used for Winston's care and for administrative expenses, but the bulk of it would be when Winston died. The foundation would inherit an estate likely worth more than it was now. Catherine stood up. She said this was insane, that they were going to fight it, that no judge in the country would let this stand. Kleinman said they had that right, but he urged them to consider the costs. Contesting the will would be expensive, time-consuming, and based on the structure Victor had put in place, unlikely to succeed. Michael asked if Kleinman had advised Victor to do this. Kleinman said he had advised Victor of the legal risks and the family consequences. Victor had proceeded anyway. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. The siblings left with copies of the will and contact information for the trustees. No one said goodbye to Kleinman. In the elevator, Catherine started crying. Not softly. Not softly, in loud, jagged sobs that made the other passengers step back. David tried to comfort her, but she pushed him away. She said her father had humiliated her, that he'd left her life's work to a dog, that everyone would know, that this would be in the press. Michael was on his phone, already calling attorneys. He was looking for someone who specialized in trust litigation, someone who'd handled high-profile estate disputes. James said nothing. He stared at the elevator doors, his face blank. Outside, on the street, they stood together for a moment. 3 siblings who had never been close, now bound by a shared loss that felt more like an insult. Catherine asked what they were going to do. Michael said they were going to fight, that they'd find a way to break the will, that $500,000 wasn't enough, that they deserved more. James said he needed a drink. They separated. Catherine and David went back to Connecticut. Michael and Lauren stayed in the city to meet with lawyers. James walked to the nearest bar and ordered a double whiskey. None of them went to see Winston. If stories like this interest you, subscribing helps you catch the next one. The first article appeared 3 days later in the New York Post. The headline read, "Billionaire leaves fortune to dog, cuts kids out with pocket change." The story was brief, but damaging. It included the basics: Victor's net worth, the structure of the trust, the $500,000 payouts to each child. It quoted an anonymous source close to the family who described the siblings as devastated and blindsided. By the end of the week, the story had been picked up by 6 major outlets. Cable news ran segments debating the ethics of pet inheritance. Legal analysts discussed whether the will could be contested. Animal rights activists praised Victor's generosity. Financial commentators called it a publicity stunt. The Harlan siblings didn't comment publicly, but privately, they were unraveling. Catherine's gallery was 3 months behind on rent. She'd been counting on an inheritance to settle the debt and fund a new location she'd already signed a lease for. Without that money, she was facing bankruptcy. Her husband David had his own financial problems. He'd lost his job in 2019 after a securities fraud investigation. He hadn't worked since. They'd been living off credit and the assumption that Victor's death would solve everything. Now, David was pushing Catherine to sue. He'd already consulted 2 attorneys, both of whom said contesting the will would be difficult, but not impossible. The key was proving that Victor had been unduly influenced or that he lacked mental capacity when he signed. Catherine wasn't sure. She kept thinking about the last time she'd seen her father, 2 weeks before he died. He'd been weak, but his mind had been sharp. He'd asked about the gallery. She'd lied and said it was doing well. He'd nodded, and she'd seen something in his eyes. Not affection, something colder, like he knew she was lying and had already decided what to do about it. Michael, meanwhile, was drowning. His venture capital firm had invested heavily in a tech startup that had collapsed in He'd personally guaranteed loans to keep the fund afloat, and those loans were now due. He owed $11 million to 3 different creditors. His wife Lauren was talking about separation. She'd married him when he was successful. Now, he was a liability. Michael was convinced there was a way to break the trust. He hired a firm called Bachman & Stone, known for aggressive litigation in estate disputes. The lead attorney, Paul Bachman, told Michael that the case was challenging but winnable. The strategy would be to argue that Victor had been manipulated by his attorney, Richard Kleiman, or by the trustees themselves, that the will was a product of undue influence during a period of physical and emotional vulnerability. Bachman's retainer was $250,000. Michael paid it with money he didn't have. James did nothing. He took his $500,000 when it was distributed in late October and spent the first $50,000 in 6 weeks. He bought a new car, a used Porsche that broke down within a month. He paid off some debts. He gambled. He drank. One night in early November, he called Catherine. He was drunk. He said he didn't understand why she and Michael were fighting, that their father had made his choice, that maybe they should just accept it. Catherine hung up on him, but James had touched on something that Catherine and Michael didn't want to acknowledge. Somewhere beneath the anger and the financial panic, there was a deeper question. Why had their father done this? The video statement was played on November 9th in Richard Kleiman's office. Catherine and Michael both attended. James did not. The video had been recorded on March 28, 2021. 2 weeks before Victor signed the will. He was seated in a chair in Kleinman's conference room. He looked thin, but alert. His voice was steady. He began by stating his full name, the date, and his intention to create a last will and testament. He confirmed that he was acting of his own free will, without coercion, and that he understood the legal and financial implications of his decisions. Then he addressed his children directly. He said he had watched them, over the course of their lives, become people he didn't recognize, that he had given them opportunities, education, support, and money, and that they had used those things carelessly. That Catherine had been married 3 times. Each marriage ended because of her spending and her inability to live within her means. That Michael had built a career on borrowed money and false confidence, and had never once taken responsibility for his failures. That James had treated life like a series of temporary distractions, never committing to anything or anyone. He said he had tried for years to help them, to guide Tim, to set boundaries. But every boundary had been met with resentment. Every refusal had been treated as cruelty. He said he loved them, but he didn't trust them, and he didn't believe that giving them money would make them happy or whole. He said Winston had been the only constant source of companionship in his final years, that the dog had asked for nothing except presence, that Winston represented something his children had never managed: unconditional loyalty. He said he hoped they would understand someday, but he wasn't holding his breath. The video ended. Catherine was shaking. Michael's jaw was tight, his hands clenched. Kleiman asked if they had any questions. Catherine asked If their father had really believed that, if he'd really thought they were that worthless, Kleinman said he couldn't speak to Victor's inner thoughts, but he could say that Victor had been consistent in his reasoning over the course of multiple meetings, and that he'd had many opportunities to change his mind. He hadn't. Michael asked if Kleinman felt good about this, about helping a dying man punish his children. Kleinman said his job was to execute his client's wishes, not to judge them. They left without another word. That night, Michael and Catherine met for dinner at a restaurant in Midtown. It was the first time they'd spoken privately since the will had been read. Michael told Catherine about his debts, about the loans, about Lauren threatening to leave. He said he needed the inheritance, that $500,000 wasn't enough, that he'd lose everything. Catherine told him about the gallery, about the lease she couldn't afford, about David's unemployment, about the humiliation of having their father's contempt broadcast to the world. They talked about the video, about the things Victor had said. Michael argued that their father had been bitter and sick, that he'd rewritten history to justify his cruelty. Catherine wasn't sure. She remembered moments from her childhood, times when her father had tried to connect with her and she'd been too busy, too distracted, too focused on what she wanted. That they could argue Victor had been unduly influenced by Kleinman, or that the video had been recorded under duress. Catherine asked if he really believed that. Michael said it didn't matter what he believed. It mattered what they could prove. Catherine agreed to join the lawsuit. She signed a retainer agreement with Bachman and Stone the following week. The cost was another $200,000, which she borrowed against her house. She pushed the thought away. Michael said they needed to move forward with the lawsuit, that Bachman had a plan. James, when he heard about the lawsuit, wanted no part of it. He told Catherine he was done, that fighting over their father's money wouldn't change what he'd thought of them, that it would only prove him right. Catherine called him selfish. She said he'd already taken his $500,000 and wasted it, that he had no right to judge them for trying to survive. James said survival and greed weren't the same thing. They didn't speak again for 8 months. The lawsuit was filed on December 3rd, 2022, in New York Surrogate's Court. The plaintiffs were Catherine Harland Pierce and Michael Harland. The defendants were the trustees of the Victor Harland Irrevocable Trust, Harold Chun, Margaret Osei, and Dr. Vincent Torres. The complaint alleged undue influence, lack of testamentary capacity, and breach of fiduciary duty. It argued that Victor Harland had been manipulated by his attorney and by unnamed parties with a financial interest in the trust's administration. It requested that the will be declared invalid and that the estate be distributed according to New York's intestacy laws, which would divide the assets equally among Victor's 3 children. The trustees responded through their own attorney, a woman named Elena Vasquez, who specialized in trust defense. Her response was brief and precise. She argued that the will was properly executed, that Victor had been mentally competent, and that the plaintiffs had no evidence of undue influence beyond their dissatisfaction with the outcome. She also filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the lawsuit was frivolous and that the plaintiffs were attempting to use the courts to overturn a valid testamentary document simply because they disagreed with it. The motion was denied. Judge Marianne Horder, who was assigned to the case, ruled that the plaintiffs had raised sufficient questions to warrant a trial. The trial was scheduled for June of 2023. In the months leading up to the trial, the Harland family became a spectacle. Reporters camped outside Catherine's home in Connecticut. Michael was photographed leaving Bachman's office, looking haggard and thin. James gave one interview to a local San Diego newspaper, in which he said he thought his siblings were embarrassing themselves and that his father had been right to cut them off. The quote went viral. Catherine and Michael stopped speaking to James entirely. Meanwhile, Winston was living in a townhouse on the Upper West Side, cared for by a living assistant named Karen Delgado. Karen had been hired by the trustees specifically to manage Winston's daily needs. She was paid $65,000 a year, plus housing. The townhouse itself was owned by the trust, valued at $3.8 million. Photos of Winston occasionally appeared on social media, posted by people who recognized him during walks in Central Park. He looked healthy, happy, unaware that he was at the center of a legal war. Dr. Winston Torres, one of the trustees, and Winston's primary veterinarian, gave an interview to The Atlantic in March of 2023. He described Winston as a calm, well-adjusted dog who enjoyed routine and companionship. He said the trust was managed conservatively, with investments in low-risk assets designed to preserve capital. He said the annual costs of Winston's care, including housing, medical expenses, food, and care and salary, totaled approximately $98,000. The article noted that the trust's investment income in 2022 had been just over $206 million. The disparity was staggering. The trust was generating $200 million a year to care for a dog that cost less than $100,000 annually to maintain. Public opinion was divided. Some people saw it as a beautiful act of love, a man ensuring his pet would be cared for. Others saw it as obscene, a grotesque misuse of wealth that could have helped thousands of people. Catherine and Michael's attorneys tried to use the public sentiment to their advantage. They argued that the trust was wasteful, that it served no legitimate purpose, and that it violated public policy by locking up billions of dollars for the benefit of an animal. Elena Vasquez, the trustee's attorney, countered that Victor Harland had the legal right to dispose of his property as he saw fit, that there was no law requiring a person to leave their wealth to their children, that the trust was properly structured and fully compliant with New York law. The trial began on June 12, 2023. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the gallery. Sketch artists sat in the back row, capturing the faces of the siblings, the attorneys, the judge. Catherine sat on the left side of the room, next to her husband, David. Michael sat beside his attorney, Paul Bachman. Lorraine, Michael's wife, was not present. She'd filed for separation 2 months earlier. On the right side sat the 3 trustees, along with Elena Vasquez. Judge Holder, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 60s, opened the proceedings by reminding everyone that this was not a theater, that the case would be decided on evidence and law, not public opinion. Bachman began with his opening statement. He painted Victor Harland as a man in decline, isolated and vulnerable, who had been taken advantage of by opportunistic advisors. He argued that no rational person would leave billions of dollars to a dog while cutting out their own children, that the will was a product of manipulation, bitterness, and diminished capacity. Vasquez's opening was simpler. She said Victor Harland had been clear, consistent, and legally competent, that he had made a choice, and that choice deserved to be respected. The first witness was Richard Kleinman, Victor's estate attorney. Bachman questioned him aggressively. He asked whether Kleinman had suggested the pet trust structure, whether he'd stood to benefit financially from the trust's administration, whether he'd evaluated Victor's mental state or simply taken his instructions at face value. Kleinman was calm. He explained that Victor had initiated the idea of leaving his estate to Winston, that Kleinman had advised him of the legal risks and had urged him to reconsider, that Victor had refused. He confirmed that he'd arranged for 2 independent physicians to evaluate Victor, both of whom had found him mentally sound. He said he had no financial interest in the trust, and had declined an offer to serve as a trustee. Bachman pressed him on the video statement. He suggested that the video had been scripted, that Victor had been coached on what to say. Kleinman said the video had been Victor's idea, that Victor had spoken freely, without notes, and had recorded it in a single take. Vasquez, on cross-examination, asked Kleinman if Victor had ever expressed regret or doubt about the will. Kleinman said no, that Victor had been resolute until the end. The next witness was Dr. Evelyn Park, one of the physicians who had evaluated Victor in March of 2020. She testified that she'd spent 90 minutes with Victor, conducting a standard mental status examination. She'd found no evidence of cognitive impairment, delusion, or diminished capacity. Victor had been oriented to time and place, able to reason abstractly, and fully aware of his assets and his family relationships. Bachman asked if she'd considered the possibility that Victor was suffering from depression or emotional distress. Dr. Park said she had, that Victor had shown some signs of sadness, which was understandable given his terminal diagnosis. But sadness was not the same as incapacity Victor had understood the consequences of his decisions and had articulated clear, logical reasons for them. The third witness was Margaret Osei, one of the trustees. She walked the court through the trust's financials, the asset allocation, the annual expenses, the investment strategy. She confirmed that the trust was being managed conservatively and that all expenditures were documented and reviewed quarterly. Bachman asked why the trust needed $3.8 million worth of real estate to house a dog. Osei explained that the townhouse had been purchased as a long-term asset, that it would appreciate in value and would eventually be sold when Winston died, with the proceeds going to the foundation, that it was more cost-effective than renting. Bachman suggested that this was absurd, that the trustees were living lavishly off the trusts while claiming to serve a dog's interests. Osei corrected him. She said the trustees received no salary, that they were volunteering their time, that the only paid employee was Karen Delgado, Winston's caretaker. The courtroom murmured. On the fourth day of the trial, Catherine took the stand. She was nervous, her voice shaking as she was sworn in. Bachman led her through her testimony gently, asking about her relationship with her father, her memories of childhood, the support Victor had given her over the years. Catherine described a father who had been distant but generous, who had paid for her education, her first apartment, her wedding, who had helped her open the gallery. Bachman asked when things had changed. Catherine said she didn't know, that somewhere along the way, her father had stopped believing in her, that he'd started seeing her as a failure, as someone who couldn't manage her own life. She started crying. Bachman asked if she believed her father had been in his right mind when he signed the will. Catherine said she didn't know, that the father she remembered wouldn't have done this, that something must have changed. On cross-examination, Vasquez was direct. She asked Catherine how much money Victor had given her over the years. Catherine didn't know exactly. Maybe $2 million? Maybe more. Vasquez asked what had happened to that money. Catherine said she'd used it for the gallery, for living expenses, for things she needed. Vasquez asked if the gallery had ever turned a profit. Catherine said no, but that wasn't the point. Art wasn't about profit. Vasquez asked if Victor had ever expressed concern about Catherine's spending. Catherine admitted he had. Multiple times. Vasquez asked if Catherine had ever paid him back. Catherine said no. She'd assumed it was a gift. Vasquez let the silence sit. Then she asked Catherine if she'd visited her father in the hospital before he died. Catherine said yes. 3 times. Vasquez asked what they'd talked about. Catherine said they'd talked about memories, about family, about the estate. Vasquez asked if Catherine had asked for money during those visits. Catherine hesitated. She said she'd mentioned the gallery's financial problems, that she'd hoped her father might help. Vasquez asked if Victor had agreed to help. Catherine said no. He'd said he couldn't. Vasquez asked if that had made Catherine angry. Catherine said no. She'd been hurt, disappointed. Vasquez nodded. She said she had no further questions. Michael's testimony was similar. He described a father who had been supportive in his youth, but critical in adulthood, who had never understood the risks of entrepreneurship, who had judged Michael for his failures without acknowledging his efforts. Bachman asked if Michael believed his father had been unduly influenced. Michael said he didn't know how else to explain it, that the will didn't reflect the father he knew. Vasquez, on cross-examination, asked Michael about his debts. Michael was evasive. He said he'd made some investments that hadn't worked out. Vasquez asked how much he owed. Michael said it was complicated. Vasquez produced documents, loan agreements, credit statements, court filings. She walked through each one methodically. $11 million in total debt. She asked if Michael had told his father about the debts. Michael said no. He hadn't wanted to worry him. Vasquez asked if Michael had planned to use his inheritance to pay off those debts. Michael said he'd hoped to, that he'd been counting on it. Vasquez asked what would happen if he didn't get the inheritance. Michael said he'd probably lose everything. Vasquez said she had no further questions. The final witness was Dr. Alan Greenberg, a neuropsychologist hired by Bachman to testify about Victor's mental state. He'd never met Victor, but he'd reviewed medical records, the video statement, and depositions from people who'd interacted with Victor in his final months. Dr. Greenberg testified that terminal illness often led to changes in judgment and decision. That pain, medication, and emotional distress could impair a person's ability to think clearly. That while Victor might have appeared competent on the surface, the decision to leave billions to a dog suggested underlying cognitive or emotional dysfunction. On cross-examination, Vasquez dismantled him. She asked if Dr. Greenberg had any evidence that Victor had been on medications that impaired cognition. He said no, but that it was possible. She asked if he had any evidence that Victor had been in significant pain during the meetings with Kleinman. He said no, but again, it was possible. She asked if unusual testamentary decisions were intem sylvis, evidence of incapacity. Dr. Greenberg said they could be. Vasquez asked if that meant every person who made an unconventional choice in their will was mentally incompetent. Dr. Greenberg said no, but this was different. Vasquez asked how. Dr. Greenberg said because no reasonable person would do this. Vasquez asked if he was qualified to determine what was reasonable for Victor Harland. Dr. Greenberg had no answer. Closing arguments took place on June 20. Bachman argued that the will was a tragedy, that a sick, isolated man had been allowed to make a decision that defied logic and compassion, that the court had a responsibility to correct that injustice. Vasquez argued that the will was an expression of autonomy, that Victor Harland had the right to choose how his wealth was used, that his children's disappointment didn't invalidate that right. Judge Holder took 2 weeks to deliberate. On July 7th, 2023, she issued her ruling. The will was valid. The trust would stand. Judge Holder's written opinion was 37 pages long. She acknowledged that Victor's decision was unusual and that it had caused significant pain to his children, but she found no evidence of undue influence, fraud, or lack of capacity. The medical evaluations had been thorough. The video statement had been clear. Victor had understood what he was doing, and he'd done it intentionally. She noted that the law did not require parents to be fair to their children, that testamentary freedom was a fundamental right, that courts could not overturn wills simply because they disagreed with the testator's choices. She dismissed the case and awarded costs to the defendants. Catherine and Michael were ordered to pay the trustees' legal fees. The amount was $1.3 million. Catherine's reaction was immediate. She collapsed in the courtroom, sobbing. David had to help her out. Reporters followed them to the street, shouting questions. Michael sat motionless for 10 minutes after the ruling was read. Then he stood, walked out, and disappeared. He didn't answer calls from Bachman, from Catherine, from anyone. 3 days later, he filed for bankruptcy. The story dominated the news cycle for a week. Some outlets praised the judge's decision, calling it a victory for individual rights. Others called it a miscarriage of justice, a legal system that valued animals over people. Catherine gave one interview to the New York Times, in which she said her father had broken her heart, that she would never understand why he'd chosen to hurt her, that she hoped, wherever he was satisfied. Michael gave no interviews. He moved out of his apartment in Manhattan and went to stay with a friend in Boston. Lauren finalized their divorce in August. James, when asked for comment, said he felt sorry for his siblings, that they'd lost more than money, that they'd lost the ability to see their own role in what had happened. But the story wasn't over. In September of 2023, a letter arrived at Catherine's home in Connecticut. It had been mailed from Richard Kleinman's office, but it wasn't from Kleinman. The return address listed a name Catherine didn't recognize: Maria Santos. Inside was a handwritten note and a sealed envelope marked with Catherine's name in her father's handwriting. The note from Maria Santos was brief. It explained that Maria had been Victor's housekeeper for the last 12 years of his life, that Victor had asked her, shortly before his death, to hold on to several letters and to mail them 6 months after the trial concluded, regardless of the outcome. Maria had waited. Now she was fulfilling that promise. Catherine opened the envelope with shaking hands. The letter from her father was dated August 15th, 2022, 5 weeks before he died. It began: Catherine, if you're reading this, You've already fought the will. You've already lost. And you're already angry. I'm sorry for that, but not sorry enough to change my mind. Victor's handwriting was unsteady, but legible. He wrote that he'd known his children would contest the will, that he'd expected it, that he'd watched them, over the years, become people who believed they were owed something simply because they existed. He wrote about Catherine specifically, about the loans he'd given her that were never repaid, about the promises she'd made to turn the gallery profitable, about the 3 marriages that had each ended because she'd prioritized spending over partnership. He wrote, "I didn't leave you the money because I knew what you'd do with it. You'd spend it. You'd waste it. And in 5 years, you'd be back where you started, blaming everyone but yourself." But then the letter shifted. Victor wrote that he wasn't blameless, that he'd failed Catherine in ways that mattered more than money, that he'd been absent during her childhood, buried in work, using success as an excuse to avoid the harder work of being present, that he'd given her money instead of time, and that she'd learned to equate the two. He wrote, "I made you believe that love was transactional. That's on me. But you're an adult now, and at some point, you have to decide who you want to be. I'm not giving you the money because I hope you'll figure that out without it." The letter ended, "I do love you. I just don't trust you. And I'm not sure you've ever trusted yourself. Prove me wrong. Not for me. I'll be gone. But for you?" Catherine read the letter 3 times. Then she put it down and didn't speak for 2 hours. Michael received a similar letter. His arrived the same day. Victor's letter to Michael was harsher. It detailed every failed investment, every reckless decision, every time Michael had blamed external circumstances instead of looking inward. Victor wrote that Michael had been given every advantage and had squandered all of them, that he'd built a career on debt and charm, and that both had run out. But Victor also wrote, "You're smart enough to have done this differently. That's what makes it tragic. You chose the easy path every time, and now you're paying for it. I'm not bailing you out because I don't think it would help. I think it would kill you." Michael didn't cry when he read the letter. He sat in silence, then folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. He didn't show it to anyone. James received a letter too, though his was different. Victor wrote, "You're the only one who didn't fight. I'm not sure if that's wisdom or apathy. Maybe, but you've spent your life avoiding responsibility, and in some ways, that's made you the happiest of the 3. But it's also made you the smallest." Victor told James that the $500,000 was a test, that he wanted to see what James would do with it, whether he'd waste it, invest it, or find some middle ground. He wrote, "I don't expect you to become someone you're not, but I hope you'll try to become someone you respect." James read the letter in his apartment in San Diego. He thought about the money he'd already spent. The car, the gambling, the drinks. He still had $380,000 left. He decided to do something different. The revelation of the letters became public in October, when Catherine mentioned them during a podcast interview. She didn't read the full letter aloud, but she described its contents. She said it had changed her understanding of her father's decision, that she still thought the will was cruel, but that she understood it wasn't random. Reporters tried to get copies of the letters, but Catherine, Michael, and James all refused. The public narrative shifted slightly. Some people saw the letters as proof that Victor had been thoughtful, not vindictive. Others saw them as a final act of manipulation, a way to control his children, even from the grave. But within the family, something else was happening. Catherine closed her gallery in November. She sold the lease, liquidated her remaining inventory, and used the money to pay down her debts. She didn't open another one. Instead, she took a job as a curator at a small museum in Hartford. The PE was modest, but it was steady. Her husband David left her 3 months later. He said he hadn't signed up for a life of financial modesty. Catherine let him go without a fight. Michael declared bankruptcy in December. He lost his apartment, his car, and what remained of his reputation in the venture capital world. He moved to Boston permanently and took a job at a mid-sized investment firm, working under someone half his age. It was humiliating, but it was also stable. His ex-wife, Lauren, sent him a message 6 months later. She said she'd heard he was doing better, that she was glad, that she didn't want to reconcile, but she didn't want to hate him either. Michael didn't respond, but he saved the message. James used the remaining $380,000 to enroll in a community college program for addiction counseling. He'd been sober for 4 months when he made the decision. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to cover tuition, living expenses, and a small safety net. He graduated 2 years later and started working at a nonprofit in San Diego that helped people in recovery. The pay was terrible, but he showed up every day. In March of 2025, Winston died. He was 12 years old. Dr. Vincent Torres reported that he'd passed peacefully in his sleep, with Karen Delgado beside him. The trust dissolved. As specified in the will, the remaining assets, now valued at $4.7 billion due to conservative investments and compound growth, were transferred to the Harlan Foundation for Animal Welfare and Cancer Research. The foundation's mission statement, written by Victor before his death, committed the organization to funding veterinary care for low-income families, supporting cancer research with a focus on early detection, and providing grants to animal shelters nationwide. Within its first year, the foundation distributed over $200 million. Catherine, Michael, and James were not involved in the foundation's operations. They were not invited to serve on the board. They had no say in how the money was used. But in April of 2025, Catherine received a phone call from Harold Chun, one of the former trustees. He told her that the foundation had funded a new wing at a cancer research hospital in Boston, that the wing would be named after Victor Harlan, that there would be a dedication ceremony, and that she and her brothers were welcome to attend. Catherine asked why he was telling her this. Chun said, because he thought she'd want to know that regardless of what had happened, Victor had been her father, that grief and anger could coexist, that she didn't have to choose. Catherine attended the ceremony. So did Michael. James flew in from San Diego. They stood together in the back of the room as the hospital director spoke about Victor's legacy, about the lives that would be saved by the research funded through the foundation, about the generosity of a man who had chosen to give his wealth to those who needed it most. The speech made no mention of Winston, no mention of the will, no mention of the family that had been torn apart. After the ceremony, the 3 siblings stood outside on the hospital steps. It was the first time they'd been together in over 2 years. Catherine spoke first. She said she'd been wrong to fight the will, that she'd been angry and desperate, and that she'd made it worse. Michael said he'd been wrong too, that he'd spent his whole life chasing something he didn't understand, that he was still figuring out what mattered. James said he didn't know if their father had been right or wrong, but that he thought maybe Victor had understood them better than they'd understood themselves. They didn't reconcile, not fully. The damage was too deep for that, but they exchanged phone numbers. They promised to stay in touch. It was a start. 6 months later, in October of 2025, Catherine was sorting through boxers in her attic when she found an old photo album. It was from her childhood, filled with pictures she hadn't looked at in decades. There was a photo of her father, young and smiling, holding her on his shoulders at a park. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She was laughing. She didn't remember the moment, but looking at the photo, she could see something she'd forgotten. Her father had loved her. It had just looked different than she'd wanted it to. She closed the album and put it back in the box. She didn't cry. She didn't feel angry. She felt something quieter, something like acceptance. The Harlan family never fully recovered. Catherine, Michael, and James each went on to live separate lives, connected by blood, but not by closeness. They saw each other occasionally, at holidays or significant events, but the easy intimacy of family had been lost. The inheritance had done exactly what Victor had predicted. It had revealed who they were, not in a single moment, but slowly, over months and years, as they were forced to confront the gap between who they believed themselves to be and who they actually were. Victor had known that gap existed. He'd seen it long before his death, and instead of pretending otherwise, instead of smoothing it over with money, he'd made a choice. He'd left his fortune to a dog who had never asked for anything, who had simply existed beside him, loyal and uncomplicated, and he'd left his children with a question they'd spend the rest of their lives answering. Were they capable of becoming more than the sum of their resentments? more than their failures, more than the people their father had seen when he looked at them. Some days, the answer felt like yes. Other days, it didn't. But the asking, painful as it was, had changed them. In the end, the inheritance wasn't just about money. It was about reckoning. Wheat to past with each other, with themselves. Victor Harland had known his family would fall apart. He'd known they'd fight, that they'd blame him, that they'd struggle. He'd done it anyway. Not because he was cruel, but because he believed, perhaps, that destruction could be a kind of creation. That sometimes, to build something new, you first have to let the old structure collapse. Whether he was right remains an open question. But Winston, who spent his final years in comfort and care, never doubted his place in Victor's heart. And maybe, in the end, that was the point. The estate of Victor Harland is now managed by the Harland Foundation, which continues to operate with assets exceeding $5 billion. The foundation funds medical research, animal welfare programs, and support services for families affected by terminal illness. It has become one of the most well-endowed, charitable organizations in the country. Catherine Harland Pierce still works as a curator. She lives modestly, drives a 12-year-old car, and is not She speaks to her father's memory occasionally, though never publicly. Michael Harland rebuilt his career slowly. He paid off his debts over 7 years and now works as a financial consultant, specializing in bankruptcy recovery. He lives in a small apartment in Cambridge and has limited contact with his siblings. James Harland continues to work in addiction counseling. He's been sober for over 4 years. He keeps a photo of Winston on his desk, not because he loved the dog, but because the dog represents something he's still trying to understand. The townhouse on the Upper West Side was sold after Winston's death. It's now owned by a family with 3 children. They don't know its history. Karen Delgado, Winston's caretaker, was offered a position with the foundation. She declined and now works at an animal sanctuary in Vermont. Richard Kleinman retired in 2024. He gave one final interview in which he was asked if he regretted helping Victor create the trust. He said no, that his job had never been to make people happy. It had been to execute his clients' wishes, and he'd done that. The interviewer asked if he thought Victor's children had deserved better. Kleinman said he didn't know what they deserved, but he knew what they'd gotten, and that it had been Victor's choice to give it. The interviewer asked if he thought the will had been cruel. Kleinman paused. Then he said, "I think it was honest, and sometimes honesty feels like cruelty." That interview was his last public statement. He died in 2026 at the age of 80. In his own will, he left a letter to be delivered to Catherine, Michael, and James. It said, "Your father loved you. He just didn't know how to save you, so he tried to teach you to save yourselves. Whether he succeeded is something only you can answer." None of them responded to the letter, but each of them kept it, and sometimes, late at night, when the weight of their lives felt too heavy, they would take it out and read it again, not for comfort, but for clarity. Because in the end, the inheritance wasn't for $0.2 billion. It was a question, and the question was this: who will you become when no one is coming to save you? Victor Harland had answered that question for himself decades earlier. Now, his children were answering it too. Slowly, painfully, imperfectly, but they were answering. And perhaps that was the greatest inheritance of all.